Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a highly specific and honestly very opinionated presentation titled The Entire History of Islam and Muhammad in 68 Minutes. Now, to be absolutely clear right off the bat, our goal today isn't to debate the theology or the history. We're here to objectively analyze the structural framework the speaker uses to present his worldview. Because, it's actually really fascinating to see how deeply held theological lenses can be used to construct this massive, sweeping narrative of global history. So we're going to break down exactly how this source builds its arguments step by step. To make sense of this whole 68-minute presentation, we're going to look at it thematically rather than chronologically. We'll be covering 5 main areas. 1, the 3-stage framework. 2, claims of historical expansion. 3, Sharia and political ideology. 4, comparing the founders. And 5, the theological conclusion.
Starting with Part 1, the 3-stage framework. This is the speaker's foundational premise on the life of Muhammad.
Let's move to and see how this builds. According to the source, Muhammad's life and Islam as a whole have to be understood through a specific, evolving 3-stage lens. He starts in 610 AD. Here, the speaker says Muhammad was a purely religious leader in Mecca, which represents a peaceful phase. But things shift. When he faced rejection and migrated to Medina in 622 AD, the speaker claims he transitioned into a political leader, organizing a community and leveraging treaties. And then, the final shift. In 624 AD, after a really surprising victory, where 300 of his followers defeated 1,000 Meccans at the Battle of Badr, the speaker argues Muhammad entered his third and final phase as a military leader.
Now, why does this matter? Well, this 3-part evolution is absolutely crucial to the source's overall argument because of how he defines the sunnah. The speaker describes this as the ultimate example that followers seek to emulate. Because he frames Muhammad as having become a religious, political, and military leader, the speaker argues that, essentially by definition, a mosque isn't just a religious building. In his view, it inherently becomes a political and military one as well.
Moving on to Part 2, claims of historical expansion. This covers how the source characterizes the spread of the Islamic Empire. And this brilliantly illustrates the speaker's overarching historical claims. He maps out a highly controversial 3-step process: immigrate, increase, and eliminate. He actually directly compares this to Julius Caesar's famous Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. According to the presentation, this isn't random. He claims it's a calculated strategy embedded in the religion's DNA. The source argues it begins with entering a host country as a religious refugee, then growing the population in minority neighborhoods, and eventually, in his words, dominating the political landscape through random violence.
To try and back up these massive claims, the speaker takes us on a pretty wild, rapid-fire tour of world history. He points to the Battle of Tours in 732 AD as the exact moment this expansion was halted in France. Then, and this is a really specific claim, he highlights the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 AD, arguing that this was the direct spark that ignited the Christian Crusades. It doesn't stop there. He also claims that the fall of Constantinople in 1453 cut off European trade routes, which directly forced Christopher Columbus to sail west. And finally, he caps off this timeline with the 1683 Battle of Vienna as a pivotal defeat of the Ottoman Turks.
Now, to keep his audience engaged with all these heavy historical claims, the speaker loves to weave in some pretty colorful trivia. For instance, he recounts a story that after the siege of Vienna was broken in 1683, fleeing Turks supposedly left behind bags of mysterious beans. This, according to the source, is actually what led to the popularization of coffee in Europe. And it gets even more specific. He claims a local baker who helped intercept a Turkish tunnel was rewarded by being allowed to bake a pastry in the shape of the Islamic crescent. And boom, that's how we got the modern croissant. Who knew, right?
Okay, let's jump into Part 3, Sharia and political ideology. This section looks at the speaker's definitions of Islamic law and worldview. Now, it's really important to remember here that we are looking strictly at how the speaker himself defines these highly complex legal and theological systems for his audience. He starts with the very word itself. The speaker defines Islam explicitly as submission to the will of Allah. He argues that while Westerners love to use words like peace and liberty, fundamentalists within the framework he's building define global peace entirely as global submission under a single unified caliphate.
To explain the internal logic of Sharia, at least as he sees it, the speaker contrasts the verses of the Quran, leaning right back on that earlier timeline we talked about. He claims the verses written early on in Mecca are weak or peaceful, while the later verses from Medina are strong, political, and military.
He asserts that under Islamic jurisprudence, these later, more militant verses just permanently supersede the earlier peaceful ones.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the speaker boils down the entirety of Sharia law. He presents it as a rigid, unquestionable list of do's and don'ts, which he claims are based entirely on Muhammad's personal whims. He uses a pretty striking everyday example. He says that because Muhammad reportedly liked cats, they are considered halal, or permitted. But because he allegedly disliked dogs, they are haram, or forbidden. The speaker uses this to argue that followers literally aren't allowed to question the underlying logic of the law. Their only job is to just obey it.
Moving to Part 4, comparing the founders. This is a direct contrast between Jesus and Muhammad as presented by the source.
We're reaching kind of the climax of the speaker's presentation here, where he sets up a very stark black and white comparison. On one side, he lists Jesus. According to the source, Jesus never led armies, never owned slaves, and actively forgave insults. On the flip side, he lists Muhammad, asserting that he led 66 military battles, owned slaves, and aggressively avenged insults. The speaker leans heavily on these stark contrasts to argue that the foundational DNA of these two belief systems could not possibly be more different.
To really hammer home his point about the nature of the religion, the speaker cites specific apostasy laws, throwing up this quote, "Whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him." He actually compares the entire religious structure to the Hotel California. He argues that while you're technically free to enter the religion, the systemic threat of violence means you are effectively forced to stay forever.
And that brings us to Part 5, the theological conclusion. This is the final synthesis of the speaker's worldview.
So the crucial point here is how the speaker attempts to reconcile his incredibly harsh critique of the religion with his own message of Christian love. He uses this modern tech metaphor, claiming it's not a hardware problem, it's a software problem. By this, he's basically arguing that the individual people, the hardware, are loved by God, but the ideology, the software running on their brains, is, in his view, fundamentally flawed and dangerous. We love the person, we just don't like this software, is exactly how he puts it. He synthesizes this whole 68-minute presentation by filtering all of global history through the biblical allegory of Cain and Abel. He frames Islam as the religion of Cain, a system based on human works, pride, and essentially earning your salvation with fig leaves. He claims this pride inevitably leads to violence, even comparing Cain's act to the world's first honor killing. Conversely, he frames Christianity as the religion of Abel. This, he says, is based entirely on trusting in the Lamb of God, a substitute sacrifice where grace is freely given by a just God rather than earned through submission or conquest. By dissecting this presentation, we get to see exactly how a speaker can take vast stretches of history, theology, and politics and weave them into a highly structured, single-lens narrative. It's pretty wild, right? And it leaves us with a fascinating, really provocative question to reflect on. How heavily do our own deeply held theological or philosophical lenses shape our interpretation of global history and modern conflicts? It's definitely something to think about the next time you consume any piece of historical media. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the frameworks around you.